So welcome to NCE's Future of Water panel discussion, which has been kindly sponsored by Polypipe. I'm Nadine Buddoo, Features Editor at NCE. Joining me today is Nick Ayling from Thames Water, Bronwyn Buntine from Kent County Council, Kenny Mawson from Persimmon Homes, and we have Jon Stewart, Richard Eddy and Charlotte Markey from Polypipe. So thank you to everyone for joining me today and welcome. Today we are going to be asking how has the sewerage sector guidance impacted the industry. We will also be considering why the guidance was brought in and what problems it was trying to solve initially. This event will look at what the guidance covers and the key differences from previous guidance for the industry. We will also discuss the challenges in implementing the guidance and what more is needed. I think a good place to start the discussion is with considering that wider context of why the guidance was actually brought in the first place. So from your experience, what were the common problems associated with the previous approach to surface water sewers, and how did this affect the consistency and quality across projects? I think I'm going to pick on Jon first, if that's all right.
Picking on me first. Thanks, Charlotte. I mean, for me, before sewer sector guidance, there was sewers for adoption. And I think my take on it, this was the benchmark for product selection and sewer designs. The main difference sewer sector guidance gives over sewers for adoption is that sewers for adoption was only guidance. Each water company could take various versions and add their own addendums, really, which would cause a lot of confusion. It also didn't take in considerations for national framework and the Flood and Water Management Act. But I think sewer sector guidance, or what we might call SFA 8, looks to bridge that gap. I don't know if everyone would agree.
I would say that, as Kenny Mawson speaking, the biggest problem we've had previously to that was the obviously adoption of SUDs previously, but we're going to take them on because water authorities weren't able to take them on because we weren't classified as a sewer, and local authorities to take them on were wanting considerable commuted sums, and equally with any sort of new guidance and new infrastructure as far as the transitional arrangements, as far as land values and the impact on those as well. I think it was very regionalised as far as the approach and the embracing of SUDs as well from a developer's perspective. And there was no clear guidance for water authorities. I mean, a lot of the water authorities that I've dealt with would take tension basins but wouldn't take on wet features, and it's the maintenance and the extent of the adoption were one of the biggest challenges that we faced in the sewers for adoption panel, didn't we, Nick? If you want to pick that one up.
I'd actually say before that, I think sitting on the outside on the local authority seat, that it was the failure of implementation of Schedule 3 which probably increased the momentum to update and go to SF8. Because the narrow definition of sewers meant that there was no way for other authorities or organisations to step in for adoption of sustainable drainage systems. As soon as you widen that definition of what our drainage systems are and what drainage measures we're wanting to implement in developments, for addressing climate change and such, there was a very restricted view from the sewage undertakers as to what they could adopt. So it was very timely that the update came in, after Schedule 3 had sort of failed to progress. And it meant that we had a wider adoption, a viewpoint, there was much more flexibility in it or approach to it. So it filled a gap, but I think we'll get on to that. The gap hasn't been completely filled and there is still a problem there, which we'll talk about, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Nick, I'll come to you next.
And I think there are lots of drivers. I think as Jon and Kenny have said, sewage adoption was clearly guidance. There were lots of water company addendums and variations, and there was obviously a driver, not only from developers and contractors, but actually from water companies themselves to try and find more consistency, but also to encourage competition and innovation. So actually to make the market a better and fairer place. So hence the some of the changing of the definitions around plastic pipes and definitions around other standards and specifications to make it non-contractor specific and make procurement simpler and much wider. So it's consistency, it was also competition, procurement and innovation. So there was lots of drivers of why we did what we did.
Absolutely. And Charlotte, if I come to you, were there particularly common problems that you saw across projects under the previous guidance that you would see repeated?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that for me, in this sort of particular niche that I've been involved in for, not just working with Polypipe, but previous employers, I think this idea of how you construct more of the green assets that are linked to water management, whether it's tree pits or rain gardens or any bioretention feature, and Bronwyn will know this as well, it's really difficult to standardise some of these processes, and for developers as well as solution providers to come to some kind of consensus about what good really does look like. And with the new, I suppose, adoption of a wider variety of SUDS features in the new guidance, that puts us on the right path. But I think we also need to be aware that there's still a lot we can do to help overcome some of those design challenges. We're a long way along, but we all need to respond to that as solution providers as well, to keep upping the ante. So that would be my assessment of that.
Yeah, and I think sorry to jump in, Nadine, but I think there's also the problems and certainly complication around the number of stakeholders on a housing development. It can be quite complex, and I think Bronwyn mentioned that each person or each division has their own sort of people that play a key role and have different drivers. Potentially they don't always talk to one another. There's a lack of understanding, through local planning authorities, the lead local flood authority. You've got drainage board in some areas, you've got highways, local highways, and obviously, Nick's on the call being part of, water and the sewerage companies. My understanding again is that sewer sector guidance, or SFA 8, whatever we want to call it, certainly bridges that gap and brings all the stakeholders together to collaborate across any given project.
And so from your experience, have you seen any key changes in terms of the approach to surface water drainage kind of really evolve over the last decade or so? What are some of those changes that really kind of made that change in guidance so crucial?
I mean, maybe Charlotte's best place to jump in on that part. I mean, we're certainly starting to see some changes across various water authority areas, aren't we, Charlotte? And I know. Yeah, absolutely. I think what we're seeing is a lot more innovation. So as Kenny was talking about, and Nick and Bronwyn, they've all alluded to innovation. And I think that's really critical, that as water companies start to experiment more with source control SUDS and not just doing business as usual, that gives us a catalyst to respond as well. So that's really that virtuous circle that we need to keep working on, is if we're widening the purview of the sort of assets and green features we can use to manage water, then as an industry, we respond to that. And we are seeing a lot more innovation on developments, but as Bronwyn will probably say, is it quick enough? So there's quite a lag between the things you see come onto the market and what people are comfortable with installing. So I think I see more innovation in public realm than residential, but that's just a personal perspective. Local authorities tend to be really quite innovative sometimes with working with solution providers to pilot solutions and show people that it can work. Whereas I think on residential schemes, as we've discussed, there's so many people, and developers quite rightly want to think about the adoption and the long-term maintenance and how that's going to play out. So hopefully this guidance will give a little bit more of a cushion for them to know what they can experiment with more.
Bronwyn, I saw you nod away there. Is that something you agree with? Oh, you're still on mute. See, we knew it would happen at least once.
I'd agree, certainly, I think, on the public realm, and that is which is within local authority control, and the ability to be maybe a little bit more testing of situations and projects which can go in, and the use of pilots. That's something, that Kent's quite supportive of, to try new things out, to act as demonstrations, both for our own local authorities, but also, those within the development community. I think there is a challenge in working across the board. I think it was Jon or Nick mentioned about, that the new sector guidance was to bring people together. Unfortunately, I don't think that all sewage undertakers are the same, and we certainly are quite envious of how successful and how innovative other authorities are in other parts of the country. And that's the one thing that I think is possibly not being as successful, is that it is to bring consistency, but there's still a little bit of differences in interpretation and application. And you're going to get that with any, a commercial business, situation. Whereas with local authorities, we've got a little bit more in control. And as long as we know we've got funding and capacity, we can try and do something. That's probably more our constraint, is that funding situation.
Absolutely. And Richard, just coming to you, is that something you've seen across your experience, that kind of drive for more innovation and obviously those disparities from client to client?
Yes, certainly we do see things, and also from, if you go back into prior to the new design and construction guidance, we did see a lot of variation between different sewage undertakers and water undertakers in terms of their approach to what they would adopt, not just in terms of SUDs, but also in terms of other materials and other practices as well. So we can see that it's only been in just over a year, but we can see things are definitely changing. They are moving to more of a level playing field, I would have said. Yeah.
That's great. And so just moving the conversation on a stage, let's consider how the guidance, considering the guidance in a bit more detail, but the differences from previous guidance. So firstly, let's look at how the new adoption code aims to unlock the uptake of a wider range of sewer types. So what types of systems are actually considered adoptable under the new rules? And are these new rules being applied consistently by all water companies? So Nick, I'm going to come to you first.
No, they're not being applied consistently, and it's because the definition of the sewer is a legal definition. So the code itself cannot specify and define what a sewer is and what one isn't. It can only suggest, and that's the problem of the document and the drivers from Water UK and Ofwat, is that it needs a legal backup, and it needs changes in primary legislation to tie it all together. The definition of a sewer, all of us on the panel could have a different definition, and nobody would be wrong and nobody would be right, because it would be an interpretation, and until a judge or a government body sets what that legal definition should be. So that's the problem, where the surface water element and the SUDS element will fall down, because you can have 15 water companies with different levels of interpretation and definition. So one may, as Thames may say that we don't agree full stop, you may have somebody that has, yes, we'll adopt everything and we consider all SUDs to be a sewer. All the other water companies may fall somewhere along that line, and you'll get different variations.
Bronwyn, can you add your perspective from the local authority point of view? You're just on mute again.
I should just leave it open. I think Nick is quite right. It is the question of definition of sewer, but there's also this integration with open space and how it integrates with other management that happens within a development. We have, Kenny will probably talk to this, but there are a lot of different house builders. They have a lot of different, I would say, standards that they approach. They approach things in a different way. You have those which have probably more a denser type of development, all the way through to those who embrace actually having quite high-end, large open space, well manicured, lots of greenery. So they have a different perspective on what the drainage provisions should be, and they have a different perspective on how they want to approach adoption. And the problem you have is that those on the probably the lower end, who are probably more satisfied with pavement systems, whether it be permeable pavement or different types of attenuation created systems, probably less green, but they may be totally suitable for that situation, up to those on the green end who want to have full open features, surface water swales off the back of the carriageway, etc. they're different perspectives. The one on the bottom end would probably want full adoption of everything. The ones on the top end or the other end, the green end, actually want control of the maintenance of their landscape themselves. So I think that it's how you, apart from the sewer infrastructure itself, is how do you address the maintenance, that other maintenance portion of it. And I don't think, we haven't quite, cracked that nut yet. And the other part of that, though, is when you're talking about the definition of sewer within regulation, is this question of what's mandatory and what's not mandatory. I'd had discussions with Yorkshire Water last year, the other years while they were working up the sector guidance, and it was quite clear their expectation was that this is mandatory. However, there's still a choice here, and the developer still has a choice as to how they approach adoption and whether they seek adoption. So that's one part. The other part of that is what happens with Section 42, and this is, the ability to connect to a public sewer. And I think this is something that, Nick may speak to, is that, that's not being commenced because that is part of Schedule 3, and the government is considering it and considering how we would proceed with that. And that ties in too with that definition of a sewer. So there's a whole lot of, there are other parts of regulation that would be exceedingly beneficial, to revisit and reassess and work out, how do you move it forward in primary legislation, because it is quite key topic at the moment, certainly with the Environment Audit Committee, what's happening with, looking at water quality in rivers, focus on CSOs, climate change. We were hit quite badly by intense storms this last, week, 2 weeks in Kent, and a lot of questions about, is this normal and how are we going to address it? So you do need to start to revisit the legislation again, I think.
Right. And Kenny, can you give us a bit of insight in terms of a housing developer's point of view, and obviously the interpretation of those rules and applying them consistently? What are the challenges that you're seeing?
The biggest challenge from any developer's perspective is obviously that when any new legislation comes forward, is at that point when it comes forward, because generally speaking, as far as when we're putting planning applications in for any sort of development, and I'm speaking broadly across the development sector, housing sector, is that those deals have probably been underway for a number of years, and so the legislation probably wasn't in place or thought about at the point when you've agreed the land value. Mm-hmm. So as far as it's obviously the transitional arrangements that come forward as far as implementation of any new legislation. And when I'm speaking from the Persimmon's perspective, I know Bronwyn mentioned as far as different developers approach it differently in a separate manner. Persimmon have said that their focus is obviously on sustainable developments and non-design, and it is a focus on embracing so to be part of that philosophy for Persimmon going forward. And looking at new schemes, it's more than the certainty that we will be looking to embrace SUDs and look at different methods of sustainable drainage, and looking at improving water quality as well as providing light swales, etc. I think the biggest issue that developers face is previously, as I touched on earlier, is the adoption of any sort of SUD that we put in place, because previously the regional variances and from different water authorities have approached that is prior to the implementation of the guidance. Some water authorities were quite open to the use of SUDs and the adoption of those by management companies. And we were able to implement those with different stakeholders, whereas some water companies were completely adverse to that. And like Nick touched on earlier, there's across the piece, there's different approaches from different water authorities as to what they consider to be in a sewer. And it's from a developer's perspective, is when we come up with any scheme, is that it's important that that's being maintained properly for our customers. And so it's important that it gets handed over to, whether that's a MANCO or whether it's over to a local authority or to a water company. It's important for our customers that those are properly maintained. So that's that from a developer's perspective.
Can I come back to one thing, just in what Kenny said, and that's about transitional arrangements. That's one thing that sometimes I'm a little bit concerned that there's a perception on the outside of the development industry, whether it be in government or other considerations, that things are instantaneous, and that's not the case. You know, when they do reviews, you know, they did reviews of the implementation of how SUDs were going, and it was only 2 years after, you know, we'd come in as lead local flood authority. Well, the lead time on development, it does take a year plus sometimes to come through planning. And we are seeing developments. I still have applications coming to me that have been in planning since 2015, even ones before 2010. And these are very, very large scale developments. And they have the drainage approach that they have. And so you have to accept that. And you have to struggle then how you're going to make sure that they are actually adaptable for climate change, given that they didn't have any consideration of 20% or 40% in their drainage design. So that is something that we always have to be mindful of when the industry reflects on how we're implementing things. You know, there has been change, and change has been good. And I think the LLFAs have actually really, I would say, certainly for us in Kent, I think we're adding value. We have a lot of pre-application discussions. We have very good relationships with a number of our builders within Kent who come to us first and essentially do due diligence through, you know, what information have you got? How would we want to approach this? And if you do it in pre-application, you've done it before, you know, the pencils hit the paper, and you're saving money. If you're coming to the, I guess, not the regulator, but you're coming to people who have an impact on how your design is delivered when the design is already being completed, when you've already paid thousands of pounds to master planners and architects, then change is unlikely to happen. So, you know, if you have an old, I'd put this out to the audience that will be listening. If you have something that is coming through planning, even if it's old, you need to go and talk to your lead local flood authority and district council as soon as possible, that you know that it's going to proceed. You know, some things are missed in due diligence as well. Some things have changed, and you need to be able to reflect that, because as I'm always told by the LPAs, planning decisions are made on the current regulation at the time. So, you know, if something's been hanging around since 2005 and doesn't have a proper climate change allowance or the right rainfall statistics, well, adjustments are going to have to be made. You know, they can't move that bar, I'm afraid.
So you're saying, Bronwyn, you're comfortable revisiting things? You know, what is the date for transition? Because I know it was sort of echoed that it was October of 2020, wasn't it? But is there an actual date?
I mean, we would always engage early on with every local authority, lead local authority, but as I think Nick touched on earlier, there's a lot of other stakeholders that's involved, and especially at the planning stage. And it's even within planning authorities, you might have lead local authorities that are quite proactive, but their internal highways department are quite historic in their approach towards SUDs. So you do get that conflict even within local authorities, unfortunately. But I would concur with Bronwyn's thoughts there, is the early engagement on any scheme, and to look into, because it's not just about it's about from a developer's perspective, it's providing a more aesthetically pleasing scheme and the development for our customers as well. And by integrating SUDs, you can benefit the overall development and how it looks as well, and the amenity. So it's there, not just there to obviously serve a purpose from a drainage perspective. You can actually benefit the scheme. We're dealing with a scheme in Rotherham that we're actually introducing a basin in that's going to actually be the opening out of the entrance to the development and form a key vista to the development. And it's actually improved the scheme, even though we're losing density on that scheme. And we feel we'll have a better scheme for our customers going forward.
Yeah, so it's all the benefits that green assets brings, isn't it? You're saying, Kenny, yeah?
Yeah.
And Charlotte, I can see your virtual hand up.
I just wanted to come back to something that Bronwyn said, because she kind of mentioned that, you know, paying thousands of pounds to master planners and designers, and the kind of difference between the designs pre and post the guidance. And I think that's actually a really critical part of getting it right that we don't often talk about, because for our team, you know, we spend a lot of time talking to landscape architects, drainage engineers and master planners. And I think sometimes they don't always do the best by the developer, or they don't always kind of think about the scheme in the round before that goes forward. And I think there's also a huge responsibility on practitioners across disciplines to actually synthesize the water management with the sustainable urban drainage and green infrastructure, and actually get those components to work together. Because probably what Bronwyn doesn't see is that cohesive thinking, and developers don't always have the time and resources to sometimes go back and say, no, could you make that more multifunctional? Could you get that right? You know, it's really difficult if you're a large scale developer to ensure that you're getting the best out of the practitioners that you're outsourcing that work to. So I'd be interested to see what Kenny and Bronwyn think about that. But I see some variable quality in that master planning stage as well, that I think sometimes has an impact on what gets delivered at the end.
I would say that silo thinking is really difficult to be overcome. So one thing that I find interesting in the last few weeks and months, you know, is the pressure on policy for trees. You know, the inclusion of trees has been specifically mentioned. I would love to see more trees in development, but as Kenny alluded to, you know, highways might not necessarily agree with trees in certain locations, or they may draw a commuted sum, which actually makes them economically not the best way to proceed. So, okay, if trees become regulated or required, mandatory, then you've got a higher driver to deliver trees. And, you know, our part of our department can go and beat up on highways and say, you need to change your thinking. So you start that ball rolling. But there's also, I think, something about, I wouldn't say the usability or multifunctionality. I mean, as Charlotte's aware, we've recently had a project with tree pits down in Margate, where we're looking at attenuation as well as just normal tree pits, and we're going to have testing on them. They're not necessarily as efficient for us economically wise as to other types of drainage measures, but it does resolve one or two issues, local drainage problems at specific locations for us. So we really wanted to test it out to see, you know, what's the applicability for that as a drainage measure, and cost, understand the full true cost of implementation of these types of measures. But, you know, if a landscape architect's coming along, he's got trees at certain locations, how often do they then go and talk to the drainage designer and say, I've got 10 trees here. If we put crates underneath 5 of them, does that help you out? Or does the drainage engineer walk across to the landscape architect and say, you know, I'd like some, you know, gully pickups off this part of the highway, or I'm having problem getting this part of the highway into the drainage system because of levels. You know, I have so many engineers who'll immediately want a gravity fed system and they land raise by 700 mil. And I'm like, that's not sustainable. So there's that type of thinking, I think. It's about a very particular specialism in each of the professions, whether they're engineers or landscape architects or planners, where you miss out on bits and pieces. And in the end, when we come to the end and looking at designs, we're struck with something that I would say is probably not the best design for the situation. And there's been compromises in different ways to achieve something. And it's a little bit like, well, if you'd actually sat around the table and, you know, gas bagged for half an hour, you might have actually recognised that, no, just to have that highway adoptable and at a certain gradient meant that you're lifting it here and you're scuppering your drainage and you're doing X, Y, and Z. But the problem is, and I think this is probably the question for Kenny, I don't know if some of it can be overcome, is that when land comes forward, more often the first step is to engage a planner who more often or not will design something on a flat table, and they don't necessarily appreciate topography, water, some of those other contributions that are highways issues, which is a bit of a problem. So if you'd had other wider technical teams right at the very beginning, you might have picked up some issues that potentially might be a problem.
And is that case study, Bronwyn? Is that on a housing development scheme? Is it the tree pits?
The tree pits are actually on local roads. We have flooding in All Saints Road in Margate, and a number of years ago we looked at the wider catchment of how we could take highway runoff out of the catchment. We put a soakaway in one location. We did a retrofit within a public park, and the phase 2 of that was tree pits along the contributing roads to take out 3 roads. A case study will be coming forward, and it will be something that we'll be supporting for monitoring, you know, for the next while, because it is a question. It's we're hoping that we'll be able to understand what are going through these systems, because there's always assumptions made about that. So it's going to be interesting, yeah.
And that does also affect the viability, doesn't it? Because probably from Kenny's point of view, you know, a lot of the more well-known solution providers of tree pits, you're talking about, you know, 4 or 5 grand a tree pit, which on a lot of schemes is not viable. Whereas what we're trying to do as an organisation, I can speak from experience, is bring the cost of those kind of systems down, because otherwise you don't get the volumes and you can't, you know, Kenny's design team will probably take that straight out the equation if they see something like, you know.
It does. It comes back to, I've got to say, pounds per cubic metre of water, you know, and probably the cheapest way to deal with everything is to have no drainage infrastructure and have a pond down the end of the road and convey all your water down the highway and put it in a big pit in the ground, because groundworks, relatively wise, volume wise, is cheap. You know, it's when you start adding extra kit to it, when you add your pipes, your aggregate, concrete stuff, you know, crates, everything else, your costs start to increase. But, you know, if you're dealing and this is the other conflict you have, you know, from our perspective, we would much prefer to see soil control happening, see green roofs, you know, rain gardens, and et cetera, but incrementally, I would probably say cost-wise, better to put in a pipe, shove it down the end of so you've got this conflict happening, I think, benefits versus costs. And again,
it's the unknown, isn't it, Bronwyn? I think it's the unknown on that element. I mean, you know, from a developer's point of view, I'm sure Kenny will jump in, and you know, it's about having the most cost-effective, compliant solution. But obviously, giving you choice now, Kenny, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's going back to me. I've mentioned it a couple of times as far as the adoption of these features is as far as green roofs and rain gardens. If they're outside the public realm and go into the private realm, it's obviously then educating our consumers as to how it's something unknown to them previously, and how they going to maintain those features and the benefits that those bring. I mean, obviously, you've seen a shift in, I think, a consumer's approach to green policies and more sustainable systems, you know, in every environment, in every business now going forward. So I think that will slowly come. But at the moment, is that I think from a developer's perspective, we have to ensure that we can get any feature that we install adopted by a stakeholder. And I think the approach we have touched on earlier, it's the inconsistencies of approaches by the stakeholders that's preventing this going forward at any sort of pace. We deal with Lincolnshire, and both the water company and the highways authority have got together early on, and and every scheme in those areas they embrace the use of suds. Not just looking at that ponds at the bottom of the side, the swales at the side of the roads, under drain swales at the sides of the development, and implementation of trees lined boulevards as well. So it's certainly, you have a different approach from different authorities. Whereas touching on the trees issue, we like in certain authorities in Yorkshire, the highways authorities don't want trees at all. And you've got that. It's again the planning authority, the local councils. That's the biggest problem I think that we face.
Can I ask a question following on from what Kenny said to Nick about the third-party private land? We struggle when we look at it from a reviewer's point of view. If a development's come forward and they really need to have on-plot drainage control, often they have created systems in private property, and it's like, well, what are you going to do about that? Certainly if it's a shared system. But another one is permeable pavement driveways. And our message to designers is that you can only proceed with this if you can guarantee that those things will continue for use into the future, because you're basically saying it's a key part of the drainage system. If you need that storage, it needs therefore to be protected. And even though it's probably unlikely for someone to rip up their driveway if it was permeable and replace it with asphalt because the bricks keep breaking or something, there's a slim possibility that might happen. But I know Thames have done pilot studies and SUDs for rain gardens or other features. How are you addressing on the private side? If those systems are there, are they private or are they part of your adopted system?
No, we're yeah, we did stuff in the last AMP, and we're doing more this AMP. So people may have seen stuff where we in terms of invited, especially local councils and other stakeholders to put forward for funding from Thames to co-fund sustainable drainage systems to remove surface water runoff from especially from our combined networks. So no, we don't adopt them. They don't become part of our asset base. And we only kind of contribute where we know there's a maintainer and a reputable one. So it's normally a council of some variety. So it's normally a government body. So whether that's you know, some kind of government like you've got Thames 100, you know, along the river, and but other whether it's a parish council, a borough council, or an LFA that may look to seek funding. So Thames can contribute. So yeah, and it's a good point that, you know, to defend my business is that we're not anti-SUDS at all, compared to most water authorities, especially with our urban areas and the City of London. We've probably got more to benefit from the utilisation of SUDS than any other water company. Especially with our old Bazalgette fantastic networks that we've got across London, but actually we need to remove surface water runoff from as much as possible. There's so much of it that we treat, there's so much of it that we pump that we don't need to, and it could be reutilised if captured at source. So that's why we fund those schemes, but yeah, we don't own any of those assets, Bronwyn.
Okay, but you still, I think that's what you said, is that you're promoting it for the benefit of yourselves and you're supporting the implementation of it. Yes. But it just doesn't fall in with your definition or application of the suicide.
And across the city, we're trying to promote about sort of £50 million over the next sort of 3 or 4 years of contribution to sustainable systems. So it's quite a chunk of money that we've got, hoping that we can spend in the right places, that not only benefits communities and gives some placemaking opportunities, but actually benefits our network and allows us to continue to deal with climate change that we've seen across London over the last few weeks.
Unfortunately, you're only 5% of Kent. So, and we've looked at our locations and we haven't come up with anything. So,
okay.
While we're on, Nick, on that on-plot element, the previous sort of private element, what would be picked up by building control, I think Richard probably would be interesting to understand. I think the change in sewer sector guidance was driving that you are now picking up some of the on-plot element in terms of foul and surface water. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes. As soon as it leaves the curtilage of one property, it can be defined as a lateral drain, and we can adopt it. So yes. So it doesn't have to be. We adopt lots and lots of assets that are not in public highway or open space. Water companies have statutory rights of access under the Water Industry Act. So we don't want lots of stuff in fenced rear gardens that's inaccessible, but if we've got access upstream and downstream, you're really looking for a new asset to have a lifespan of 80+ years that you just need maintenance of accessibility. So we do adopt stuff that's in private land.
I can see you nodding away, Richard.
Yeah, I was going to say, has that increased substantially since the change in the guidance?
No, not really, Richard. No, we've had that approach since the terminology of lateral drain come in following the private sewer transfer in 2011. So we've had that kind of approach and that option for developers if they wish to secure the adoption of lots of on-plot or smaller diameter local drainage for the past decade.
Yeah. So it's a choice by the developer, Nick, is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Okay.
So we've already started looking at some of those challenges and potential opportunities that exist under the new guidance. I was just wondering, how does the approach differ from that in Wales and Scotland and Ireland? And are there things that we can start to learn from other countries in terms of that slightly different approach? Bronwyn, you're already smiling.
Yeah, unfortunately, I gotta say England's quite unique. The devolution of the commercial entities has created a bit of a problem. I mean, I arrived here in 2003 from another place. I'd come from Australia. I had worked in the US, and the multitude of people who are responsible for surface water in a pipe struck me as particularly a difficult thing to overcome. And I hate the words, but institutional framework has actually created a problem for us in England, because you could have, if you followed it to the nth degree, 2 pipes, 2 sewers in the highway, carrying highway water and private water, and you go, why? And that is because we've got commercial entities who are who are involved in the process. So the difference, the very, very clear difference with Wales is Welsh Water, you know, one single operator, and also, you know, someone that's semi-government. So they have a different charter, I think, from those who operate within England. And so that ability then to move in and say, yes, we're going to go down Schedule 3 and SUDS approving bodies has changed the relationship between the sewage undertaker and how surface water is put in. So Wales is a completely different kettle of fish. There's a lot we can learn from them. However, you know, we've got, I think, a lot of experience on the planning side that they haven't necessarily been engaged with. And I think one difficulty, I think there is a difference of scale. You know, we see over 500 major applications in Kent annually. I have of the order of 1,800 consultations in any one year, a team of 5. It's a resource issue. You know, if you wanted to go down the adoption route in England through a local authority, there is going to be some sort of resourcing that has to be done, whether it's done through a utility charge or something else, if you were to follow what Schedule 3 looks like in Wales. So, but there's a different arrangement now. We've moved on. We've got the sewer sector guidance, which fills, you know, one particular gap. And there's a question of, well, how do we plug the rest of the gaps with adoption? You know, I think one other thing people would say, you know, they're a lot further advanced in Australia and the US in relation to SUDS adoption, and that is because they have municipal utilities. So if you look at the City of Seattle, Portland, you know, any of the other large cities in the US, they own water, wastewater, and surface water. They do the treatment, they do the conveyance, they have control. So if they have a particular approach that they want to do, Green Street programs, low impact development programs, they have the ability to set policy and have it delivered through their utility. They collect a utility charge. A lot of authorities have implemented in the last 40 years surface water charges like they're doing in Manchester, you know, based on impermeable area. It's completely different. So, you know, we're starting to test that here. Manchester is an example of it. And it is, I hate to say it, it does come back to money. It's how, if you want to have some things implemented, you need to have a financial resource. You know, we can't keep doing more with less. In this case, it is about infrastructure, it's about maintenance, about capital investment and ongoing, you know, annual, you know, money. So that's what the government's got to sort out, is if you're going to do that, who's going to do it and how are they going to do it? And you can't just turn around to a local authority and you say, oh, you can do this now. You know, a lot of the problems we have, say, in complaints against the Highways Authority is I say, well, actually, they are a Highways Authority and they are responsible for the provision of the roadway and the carriageway, not necessarily drainage. They are a Highways Authority. So if you want them to also be a drainage authority, give them more money.
So just in terms of those lessons learned from potential lessons from other countries, are there already, you know, under the new guidance, has it exposed any particular gaps in existing knowledge or experience within the industry? And I mean, Nick, this might be a question for you. In terms of the level of training and upskilling across the industry, you know, what would you like to see happening in order to overcome some of those gaps?
No, I think Bronwyn hit the nail on the head. I think there's lots of knowledge gaps within local authorities and LPAs over having a consistent approach to SUDS planning and utility planning, rather than just how many houses can fit on one field. And actually, if you want to, you know, if Schedule 3 was the answer, then there's a huge upskilling and a resource requirement for that to be delivered. So I think, you know, there are other options. You know, we canvass both DEFRA and Ofwat about the environmental bill, about making changes to the Water Industry Act to make changes to primary legislation to allow the adoption of SUDS as SUDS and not as sewers, to take away some of the unintended consequences and fears that we have. So there are some options, but Bronwyn was right. It comes about money, but it's also, you know, water companies are commercial businesses in England. We have a regulator, and again, change doesn't happen easily. So the regulator at the moment has done a series of consultations about what can water companies do better, or what can stakeholders in the industry do better to incentivise better environmental solutions. So what can we do in terms of our charging? To incentivise developers to build better things. so that they know that the cost doesn't always come to them, that we can make a contribution. So it's our wide customer base through some of our own funding that would help pay for that. The comeback on that is then actually, if water companies are maintaining sewers, as long as they're providing a service and they flow, whether they may be 80% at operational level, if they're still flowing and not blocking and not surcharging, then they're working. Doesn't matter what they look like. Obviously, green suds are completely different, and so therefore, if water companies were to maintain balancing ponds and open spaces and swales and stuff, their funding regime needs to be specific and very different, because the maintenance requirement of that is obviously completely and utterly different because of how they look is critical.
Kenny, from the developer's perspective, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah,
You're still on mute. Oh, there you go.
Yeah. I mean, it's from a developer's perspective, it just goes back to the point I've mentioned previously, as far as the issues as far as new developments coming forward. We do engage with, as Persimmon and I know other developers do engage with the stakeholders as much as possible. It's the frustrations that we find with different stakeholders' approach that causes a problem. And as far as our approach is, we're a very sustainable focused company, and we will continue to be at the forefront of design. And I know Bronwyn touched on it earlier, as far as engaging with landscape architects. We use our consultant team and look at the site now at initial principles before we even start sketching up a layout and looking at the constraints and opportunities, and looking where we can implement SUDs and improve water quality and deliver their better scheme. So there's not really much else I can add to that. It's the frustrations are with the stakeholders, really.
Just on that point, I guess, in terms of, just finally, in terms of improving that level of collaboration and communication between key stakeholders, just as a takeaway, what would be that one thing? And I think it would be important to hear from each of you. What would be the one thing that you would like to see from key stakeholders in terms of helping to improve that level of communication and collaboration right the way across the industry? And Kenny, I'll start with you.
I think it's that early engagement, like Bronwyn touched on, and it's also getting everybody to the table. I think it can be seen in, like Bronwyn's mentioned it there, and a lot of the authorities that we're dealing with are engaging at early stages and look to work with us on that. But there's also some authorities that are still set in the dark ages that don't want to embrace it at the moment. And it's probably the highway authorities are probably the predominant on that, as far as their approach to us and the new changes and the new guidance is still antiquated with their approach to it, unfortunately. And I think that's where DCLG needs to get involved and bring them to the table, because I think lead local authorities and the water companies are changing their perception and their approach towards SUDs. It's the highway authorities, it's probably the ones that are digging their heels in, shall we say.
And Nick, what would you like to see? Oh, yeah.
I would say it's. I just think primary legislation needs to change to make it a consistent approach. So if primary legislation changed, then funding has to go with it. Yeah. So it's in my view, it's in the hand of government. We've there's also been people may have seen. EFRA committees have made comments about the adoptability of SUDs and some of the floodings and climate change impacts that we've seen over the last few years, and actually they've admitted that there needs to be legislative change. So it depends. I think the government's got lots of things that had to sort out over the last few years and over the last 18 months in particular. So it's whether it gets it high on the agenda. I think the flooding of the last few weeks in London has probably had the highest coverage that I've seen in my lifetime. So I think lots of people see it, lots of people are feeling it, and actually lots of people want to see it change and improved. So I think the more people talk about it and the more people show the desire of what that kind of outcome they want, the more likely the government will then make the right changes.
Charlotte, I could see you nodding there as well.
Yeah, I think Nick's completely right, but I also think we need more of a shared vision about what we want future places and spaces to look like, because from what I see, and probably John and Richard are the same, you know, from the beginning of a project to the end of it, that vision is diluted down invariably. And there's always this kind of almost resignation with one discipline or another that we're not going to get the kind of quality outcome that we expected at the beginning. And somehow people seem okay with that. And actually, I think we've got to a point where we can't be okay with that, because we're running out of land to actually make more multifunctional and climate resilient. So it's kind of, we need a mixture of understanding the urgency, which I think we kind of do as a country, you know, coming up for COP26. We need to understand the urgency of the problem, but also develop a vision. And that isn't just the local authority or the water company adopting a few more SUDS features. That's everyone understanding what good needs to look like. And that's a really big challenge. But I think we all kind of have a responsibility to understand that vision. And that starts with public realm and residential. You know, it's not just one area. So that would be my view.
Yeah, I mean, it's good to talk, isn't it? I mean, that's key. I mean, many manufacturers, you know, the heartbeat and their expertise is in project management, you know, and that's what we want to bring to that, you know, in terms of collaboration, that early involvement. You know, we've touched on it there. We've got many choices, so that understanding of what the benefits are and what the costs, you know, we've got an education piece to deliver right through to all stakeholders, and we can all play a key part in that going forward. It's an absolute must, isn't it?
I think there's actually one more step beyond that, and this comes back to what Kenny's comment about consistency. When we were doing the working groups on the Schedule 3 for DEFRA, we had collaboration across the industry. We had working groups that consisted of local authorities, be they unitaries or two tiers, as well as Water UK, sewerage undertakers. We had everybody there, and I know the non-statutory technical standards aren't loved by particularly many people, but it was a really great process to bring together the issues we have. And unfortunately, often we do talk about big picture stuff, you know, public realm and sense of place and such. But unfortunately, it's the technical details and delivery of very specific things which scupper stuff. You know, like Kenny's comment about trees. They're okay in Lincolnshire, but maybe Kent's not so keen. So you've got to actually get down into the nitty-gritty of some of these issues, I think, to work out how they are best resolved, and would they be covered by, you know, just changing Section 42 of the Water Industry Act? Would it need some other support somewhere else? So I think I'd probably say that we need to go back to, what we need to say to DEFRA is we need to go back to having a wider working group together, because I know individually each of us are talking to DEFRA and MHCLG. I mean, I represent the Association of SUDS Authorities. We've got 77 authorities that try to share knowledge, but we have a load of experience, but, you know, getting that experience to the table so people can understand where we're having problems on one side of it. You need to balance that against the developer issues, against the supplier and manufacturer issues. DEFRA needs to hear them collectively, because a concern I have that comes out of it is often they seem to be reactive. And, you know, the flooding did happen in London last week. It also happened in the rest of the country, which I had one comment from the north. They said to me, it's not flooding just in London, it's flooding elsewhere. But some of that, unfortunately, you know, one of our return events, you know, when you actually looked at it, was 472 years. We are not going to build systems. I would hope we're not going to build systems for a 1 in a 500 year event, though our residents would love it if we put one in for 1,000 year. We simply don't have that cost, the ability to deliver that as a society. So the community, our professional community, needs to probably look at standards and say, we are prepared to make changes for these extreme events, but we're going to accept an operational standard of X, which we have at the moment. We have an operational standard. But we need to collectively come to that, because that also then needs to be delivered to the community, and they need to understand that they cannot spend all the billions to upgrade all the sewers across London. So there's a balance there.
Thank you. And just coming to you, Richard, final word in terms of your view on that collaboration piece. You're on mute.
Yes, I'm on mute. I'll just echo what's been said previously. I think it's about these changes were it's a journey, and it's not the end game yet. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done, particularly one of the comments that Kenny said about highways. you know, we cover the water companies, but the highways are still separate. So that's, you know, that's an area, but it's a journey that we need to continue down, keep talking to each other, and DEFRA definitely need to look at the primary legislation. I think is one of the key things if it's going to channel everyone down the same road.
It's exactly why events like this are so important for the industry, isn't it, really? But unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. Thank you all for taking the time to join the discussion. It's certainly been interesting, and I hope you've all gained some fresh insight today. I look forward to taking the discussion even further at our main Future of Water event on the 7th of September. Until then, thank you again for joining us. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Nadine.